Assalamualaikum and a very good day. My name is Ahmad Arshad bin Ahmad Nazran. So this presentation is entitled Digital Activism under Authoritarianism. It's a state civil society dynamics in Southeast Asia. And this is prepared for the course of Comparative Political System taught by Associate Professor Dato Dr. Marzuki bin Muhammad. So in this presentation, I examine how digital activism operates not in democratic transitions, but within authoritarian and illiberal political systems, with a particular focus on state civil society interaction in Southeast Asia. So rather than asking whether digital activism leads to democratization, this study asks a more precise and empirically grounded question: how do civil society actors adapt, persist, and sometimes survive under digital authoritarian constraint? So I will now outline the structure of this presentation. So the slide deck presents the overall roadmap of the presentation. So I'll begin by clarifying the analytical focus of the study, followed by the research questions, objectives, and scopes. I then introduce social movement theory as the core analytical framework and explain how it is operationalized comparatively. And then the empirical section is structured into three findings chapters. First, the civil society digital adaptation. Second, state countermeasures and constraints. And third, the sustainability of movements under digital authoritarianism. And finally, I will conclude with broader theoretical and comparative implications. So this structure allows the analysis to move from conceptual framing through theory to empirical findings and finally to synthesis. So the analytical focus of this study is digital activism under authoritarian constraint. Specifically, the study examines how civil society actors adapt digital mobilization strategies under conditions of authoritarian governance and increasing state repression. So the core analytic concern is state civil society interaction in a digitally mediated political space. So as illustrated in the diagram, digital platforms function as a contested arena. So they enable mobilization, coordination, and diffusion for civil society actors, while simultaneously serving as tools of surveillance, tools of regulation, and repression for authoritarian states. So rather than treating technology as inherently emancipatory or repressive, this study treats digital space as politically structured. And it is shaped by power relations, it is shaped by institutional capacity, and strategic adaptation on both sides, the state and also the civil society. And this slide further clarifies the analytical phenomenon under investigation. So empirically, digital activism in Southeast Asia operates under authoritarian and illiberal governance. So there are online platforms that enable mobilization and coordination, but these activities are constrained by surveillance, censorship, and law. Analytically, the key claim is that the state repression reshapes mobilization. So it reshapes it rather than outright eliminate it. So civil society actors, they adapt instead of disappear. So adaptation may include platform switching, encrypted communication, decentralized organization, or symbolic forms of resistance. And this matters for comparative politics because state-society relations vary. It differs systematically across regimes. So authoritarian states differ in capacity, it differs in strategy, it differs in responsiveness. And civil society's adaptation likewise varies across political and institutional contexts. So the study therefore treats digital activism as a dynamic interaction, not a static outcome. So this study is guided by three research questions. First, how do civil society actors in Southeast Asia employ digital activism to resist authoritarian control? Second, what strategies do authoritarian regimes use to counter this digital activism? Third, and most importantly for this presentation, how effective are these strategies in sustaining or perhaps challenge the political control? So correspondingly, the research objectives are to identify civil society tactics, analyze the mechanism of digital authoritarianism, evaluate effectiveness of digital activism in fostering either democratization or resisting authoritarian control. So in terms of scope, this study focuses on Southeast Asia with comparative cases of Malaysia, Myanmar, and Vietnam across recent cycles of digital activism in the 2010s and also 2020s. So importantly, the analytical focus is on adaptation under constraint, not regime transition, not democratization outcomes. So the core theoretical framework of this study is social movement theory, or SMT. So SMT is employed as the primary framework for analyzing digital activism under authoritarian governance in Southeast Asia. I use this to explain how civil society mobilizes, adapts, and sustains collective actions under repression of the state and digital constraint. So for these three components are emphasized. First, mobilization strategies. We talk about brokerage and diffusion, which enables mobilization across very fragmented networks, while digital platforms support this coordination and information flow. So second, state constraints. The authoritarian states constrain activism through surveillance, through censorship, and through law, and with variation in how repression is applied and institutionalized. And also the third is sustainability of movements. So sustainability depends on adaptation of the civil society, identity of it, and their action support that they can garner. So decentralization and flexibility also allow movements to persist under pressure. And this framework allows us to analyze digital activism not as spontaneous protests, but as structured collective action which are shaped by power and institutions. And then this slide explains how social movement theory is operationalized comparatively. And three analytical lenses are used. First, structural functional approach, which treats civil society, digital platforms, and state institutions as interacting political structures, and mobilization, surveillance, and control as its political functions. The second one is new institutionalism. New institutionalism, it highlights how formal legal restrictions exist or coexist with informal activist networks and encrypted practices. And so how the activists adapt and how it can generate feedback that reshapes those strategies or countermeasures executed or implemented by the state. And the third is the systems approach. So it conceptualizes civil society mobilizations as system input and state responses as regulation and repression, and activist adaptation as a feedback loop. So together, these three approaches allow digital activism under authoritarian constraint to be analyzed as a dynamic political system rather than isolated events or technological effects. So this slide establishes the comparative logic of the study. So rather than treating digital activism as regime specific, I situate it within shared conditions of digital expansion across Southeast Asia, while emphasizing variation in authoritarian governance. So, for example, for the first one is Vietnam. I choose Vietnam because it represents a high capacity, one-party authoritarian system, where their digital surveillance and censorship are institutionalized and also routinized. So civil society activity is structurally constrained before mobilization can take its place or can scale itself. The second one is Malaysia. So our country functions as a hybrid or semi-authoritarian regime, where electoral institutions coexist with selective repression. So digital activism operates through legal contestation, through institutional engagement, and adaptive mobilization rather than outright operating illegally. And Myanmar, following 2021 coup, they exemplify a post-coup military regime. So it is marked by criminalization, internet disruption, and coercive control. So here, digital activism survives primarily through covert, decentralized, and very high-risk strategies. So together, these cases allow comparisons across preemptive, very selective, and coercive authoritarian control, while they also hold regional and technological conditions constant. And finally, let's go to the empirical findings. So the first empirical finding addresses RQ1, focusing on how civil society adapts under authoritarian constraint. So across all three cases, activists rely on core social movement theory mechanisms: brokerage, diffusion, and coordinated action. So what differs is how these mechanisms operate. In Vietnam, brokerage is limited and decentralized, often relying on a diasporic links. So diffusion is constrained by censorship. It produces high risk of preemptive suppression. So coordination, here they prioritize timing and discretion rather than skill. But in Malaysia, movements such as Bersih, they demonstrate coalition building through social media. So hashtags and live streams, these are diffusion tactics, while hybrid online-offline coordination sustains mobilization under selective repression. And in Myanmar, brokerage becomes transnational. So it notably is through encrypted cross-border coordination. So diffusion draws from global protest repertoires, while their coordination shifts towards decentralized leadership, which is under severe repression. So the comparative pattern is clear. When adaptation is broadest, is where the coordination can move across platform and networks. And this adaptation is very narrow, and it can become narrower where repression becomes technologically institutionalized. And the second one addresses RQ2, examining how states respond to digital activism, state countermeasures, and structural constraints. So, authoritarian digital control operates through three interacting instruments. One, political opportunity structures. Second is repression adaptation. And finally the counter mobilization. So political opportunity structures determine whether activism is tolerated, whether they are criminalized or suppressed. So repression raises costs through surveillance, through arrests, shutdowns, and monitoring. And counter mobilization fragments these movements by giving disinformation, the cyber operations that is conducted by the state, and also delegitimization through the legal operation. And comparatively, Vietnam exhibits a preemptive, I would say, institutionalized digital control. So they embed the repression into the state's governance frameworks. And Myanmar, the state relies on coercive and disruptive repression. So they include internet blackouts, include militarized surveillance. And Malaysia sits between, where it is characterized by what we say legal gray zones. So the repression is selective. So here in Malaysia, the state utilizes algorithmic suppression, particularly when targeting reformist movements. So the key pattern is that as repression shifts from selective control to preemptive closure, civil society adaptation becomes increasingly decentralized. So when it's preemptive, decentralized, covert, and more fragile. And the final findings, where this response related to RQ3, it evaluates the effectiveness and sustainability. So sustained resistance depends less on tactical innovation alone than on identity formation, coordination capacity, and external recognition under repression. In Malaysia, movements show conditional sustainability. So Bersih transition from episodic mobilization to institutionalized advocacy. They are supported by a coherency of their identity, and they are internationally recognized even under selective repression. While in Myanmar, mobilization was at the start, initially it was intense, but it collapsed under extreme coercion because they have the absence of unified leadership and an absence of sustained coordination. They undermine the long-term survival. While in Vietnam, activism persists without any skills because movements survive tactically through covert and decentralized forms. But crucially, they lack identity consolidation and any kind of external validation from international community necessary for expansion. So overall, we see that where repression is institutionalized and identity remains fragmented, digital activism survives tactically but struggles to sustain any kind of transformative political pressure. And finally, I conclude with three implications. So empirically, we see that authority in Southeast Asia is not uniform. So whereas Malaysia demonstrates conditional sustainability through legal institutional pathways, Myanmar shows rapid collapse under coercion, and Vietnam exhibits a durable but very low level average activism. And theoretically, a social movement theory, I believe that it remains applicable under authoritarianism. But political opportunity structures are compressed, are unstable, and reversible. So sustainability is linked to collective identity and how they have the capacity to coordinate themselves, not really just digital innovation alone. And finally, what are the limits? So digital activism does not equal democratization. Visibility does not guarantee effectiveness. Institutionalized digital repression narrows space for mass mobilization and long-term political leverage. So the central conclusion is this: as repression shifts from episodic coercion to institutionalized digital governance, activism survives tactically but weakens strategically. And with that, I conclude my presentation. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you so much, Doctor. We'll see you again. Thank you.